for the Daily Journal, which is read by people who even do not hunt or fish, and it's my favorite column. So that says something about the way Kevin writes. He is the vice president for media for Mossy Oak, and he has written the outdoors feature for the Journal for 9 years, and he has. For 19 years, he's been with Mossy Oak. He is married to Amy Strickland Tate, and she is in charge of government relations for
Tennessee Valley Authority.
TVA, so it's a very important job. Kevin is so erudite because he's from Brewer.
No question about it.
And he is, and as I said, his column is one of my favorites. And don't take this the wrong way, but he sort of writes like an old soul. It's so poetic. It's beautiful prose, and you can tell when you read his column that he is well read. He's very well read. Kevin, we're looking forward to this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to speak to the Friends of the Library. As I got into this book, it occurred to me how appropriate it is for this review to be done for this group, because James McCafferty, who assembled this tale, did it all through the machinations of interlibrary loan. He pulled the stories that you'll hear about here in a moment together from bound and microfished and microfilmed periodicals from a century before, and would have been completely inaccessible or impossible without interlibrary loan, and of course without the support of groups like Friends of the Library. So, what is this book? The Bear Hunter, Life and Times of Robert Eager Bobo and the Canebreaks of the Old South. To me, the purpose of this book, or the gist of it, is it's as much about the land and the time in which the stories happened as it is about the person or the deeds. In my job at Mossy Oak and with the Outdoors page, and just as a general outdoors person, I hear and read a lot of hunting and fishing stories. Most especially, I have a lot of stories inflicted upon me. I've listened to a lot more stories than I ever set out to hear, and it's always interesting. I'm basically an introvert, so it doesn't take me long to retreat from the show floor or to get away from that if I can at all. But the stories in this book, to me, have the ring of authenticity because of the fallible nature of the people doing the telling. Mr. McCafferty does a wonderful job explaining how he came through one way and another to find the stories. And the stories, as I said, they're built from periodicals from right before the turn of the last century, from 1895, 1897, that era. And the person who was writing those was a character named Emerson Huff. So Mr. McCafferty's book depends largely on excerpts from Emerson Huff that were extracted as first-person history, effectively, from those old periodicals. And Mr. Huff does not set himself out to be a Superman. He doesn't set out to be the person depicted as the models and marketing collateral for outdoor companies. He's a regular guy who gets lost, he falls in the creek. He's not a buffoon, but he's the kind of person who's honest enough about his own fallibility that it makes all the rest of his stories very believable and very approachable. And I appreciated that tremendously. So to get started on the book, the author, James McCafferty, was born here in Tupelo, but grew up in the Delta. He was the son of a Methodist minister and grew up primarily in Marks, Clarksdale, and Leland. And I spoke to a lady here just a moment ago who knew the same person that McCafferty knew in Clarksdale, the son of Robert Bobo, who was also in the style of the Kings of England, also named Bob called Bobo. But he knew that person as a child. Mr. McCafferty grew up with an interest in the outdoors and an interest in history, very much like I did. And he made the two intersect with this book. McCafferty today is an attorney who practices in Macomb, but he's written scores, or by his term, hundreds of outdoor articles, several books, and he took an interest in the historical bear hunting as it went on in the Delta. And the way the two come together is it's an interesting part of things to me personally. Something I find in all outdoor writing, mine and everyone else's that's good, I hope, is underlying any hunting story is a nostalgia. There's a strong sense of nostalgia. Even stories about things that are and things that might be draw and depend heavily on the unspoken memory of how things were and might have been. The Bear Hunter is a story about a way of life in a place that is familiar, but with a face that's completely changed. This is really one of the most interesting facets of the tale to me. The descendants of the hunters, the Bobos, of course the descendants of the bears, the dogs, and even of the acreages that supported it are still among us. But the way of life and all of those opportunities are completely gone. So we start by, as I said, the land and the way of life. What did Coahoma County look like in 1895? Well, by that point, none of the old-growth forest had been cleared. There were people farming there, of course, and had been since the 1700s. But if you picture clearing this land and raising cotton on it or any other crop, not only does it all have to be cleared by hand, that clearing has to be maintained by hand. It didn't just stay cleared, especially not with forest standing all around it. So we're talking about things that happened in 1895. It's instructive to remember that up until 1832, all of that land belonged to the Choctaw. So it certainly had not been settled or cleared in any large and meaningful way before that. And archaeologists who've worked in Mississippi have found, through their investigations of where the Choctaw lived, various bone dumps where not only are there arrowheads and pottery, of course, as you're familiar with, but they figure out what these native populations ate. And to the surprise of many, they didn't eat very many white-tailed deer. They ate a lot of black bear. And why would that be? Well, if you think about the forest at the time, it was a terminal forest. It was completely old growth. There were very little edge effect anywhere. Everything was large timber or thick breaks of cane where the timber had been blown down by a tornado or something else unusual had happened. And that kind of habitat just doesn't support a lot of white-tailed deer. Bobo there were deer in Sunflower County, largely because you can imagine the edge effects of habitat you would find along creeks and rivers, along the Sunflower, of course, along the Mississippi. So they were white-tailed deer, but they were vastly outnumbered by black bear. Deer require a grass component in their diet, so they need a lot of greenery. They eat acorns, of course, but they can't live on acorns. Bears thrive on acorns. They can live on acorns and anything you would think of as soft mast, whether it's persimmons or acorns or things along those lines, grubs and whatnot. So the bear in the old forest were the predominant critter. But you think about this land being completely wild in a way that it supported panthers, it supported wolves to some extent, and it was an interesting place for sure. When we get to talking about hunting the bears, they would feed in the open forest, but then live in these canebreaks. And a Delta canebrake was an imposing sight. Let me read this little brief description here. So this comes from one of Huff's contemporaries, who was also writing in a magazine called Forest and Stream, which is published out of Chicago and was a forerunner of Field and Stream and today's magazines. So a canebrake would exist anywhere that it could get purchased, and it would spring up anywhere there was a tornado track or a lightning fire or anything opened up an opportunity for it, and it grew extremely dense. Many of us here in Tupelo have some cane in our backyards, and if you could just picture that over acres instead of over square feet, you have a really good idea of what we're fixing to talk about. Such thickets offered advantages for getting lost and staying so, which no other North American real estate can afford. Once let a man enter blue cane, he is alone with his maker. The parted reeds close behind him like water over a sinking ship. Before, behind, and all about him there is nothing but cane. He cannot lift a finger without pressing cane. Below him is a bed of cane, above him cane, for the leafy tops fairly shut out the light of heaven. In any direction he may turn, his eyes cannot pierce 6 feet. He moves on. It is cane, cane. His strength is quickly spent against the ever-yielding but ever-rebounding cane. He seeks an altitude, an opening, anything to give him bearings. There is none. There is nothing to climb for an outlook, nothing to escape by detours, nothing but cane. He is lost and can defy the very powers of a bonding agency ever to find him. So one of the things I like best about Emerson Huff, whose stories form the backbone of this book, is he was a writer and an editor for Forest and Stream. And he came to know Bobo through his association with the magazine, and he would frequently hunt here, there, and yonder around the country. He would come to Mississippi for a bear hunt and then go to Louisiana for a waterfowl hunt and then out to the Rockies for a big game hunt there. He would shoot quail with Nash Buckingham in Tennessee. He would do those sorts of things in gathering content for the magazine. So he was an outdoorsman, but no bear hunter particularly. Bear hunting was a very specialized chase. So Huff had resolved at the beginning of the hunt, and he's following his host on a horse, that should he become separated from the others, he would not attempt to find them. Rather, he would leave it to his horse to find the way home. So so picture this. To get a mental image of a bear hunt, if you could picture whatever you may have seen of an English fox hunt. Everyone's mounted. A hunt master blows a horn for a certain communication. They're communicating by way of horn. They're a raft of dogs doing the chasing, all barking, all running, and then they bound across the English countryside in pursuit of the fox or whatever they jump, and eventually come up with and close with the fox. Picture exactly that spirit, but as rough as you could possibly imagine it being. These are dogs that are running for an opportunity to close with and fight a 300, 400, 500-pound black bear. There are men on horseback chasing the dogs and one another through this cane that's so thick they would trickle through it by way of hacks. They would refer to, the hacks had names just sort of like streets or highways would have names, named for whoever had cut them through. They're literally cutting a trail 2 or 3 canes wide, enough to press through, like squeezing through the opening of an envelope, say. And they're flying through this cane. If you've ever been in or around cane, it's malicious. So getting injured by the cane was just part of the chase. Cane stuck in various body parts of make discomfort was just part of it. So these dogs, it was a hard chase and a hard way of life, but it was something pursued from instinct. So now I'll come back to that. I wanted to take this opportunity, though, to diverge a little bit and talk about what happens to you when the cane closes behind you, so to speak. So you picture this cane being twice as high as your head, and you're on horseback. And the horse is getting confused, and you've been confused, and you're trying to force your way through this stuff, and then this is what happens. So this is an excerpt from a story called The Modified Stationary Panic by Pat McManus. Every so often I read an article on how to survive when lost in the wilds, and I have to laugh. the experts who write these pieces know everything about survival, but next to nothing about getting lost. I'm an expert on getting lost. I've been lost in 9 different countries, 43 cities, 7 national forests, 4 national parks, countless parking lots, and 1 Amtrak passenger train. Since I have survived all of these experiences of being lost, it follows that I'm also something of an expert on survival. When the process of becoming lost is usually a lot of fun, the entertainment value diminishes rapidly once the act is accomplished. The small twinges of fear, however, do not last long and are soon replaced by waves of terror. I disagree sharply with most survival experts on what the lost person should do first. Most of them start out by saying some fool thing like, the first rule of survival is don't panic. Well, anyone who has ever been lost knows that kind of advice is complete nonsense. They might as well tell you don't sweat or don't get goosebumps all over your body. Survival experts are apparently such calm, rational people themselves, they assume a lost person spends considerable time deliberating the question of whether he should panic. It doesn't work that way. Over the years, I've been involved in several dozen panics, usually as a participant, sometimes simply as an observer. Most of my panics have been of a solitary nature, but on several occasions I have organized and led group panics. One of which involved 20-some people. In that instance, a utility company took advantage of the swath we cut through the forest and built a power line there. Back in the early days of my panicking, I utilized what is known technically as the full-bore linear panic. This is where you run flat out in a straight line until the course of your panic is deflected by a large rock or tree, after which you get up and spring off in the new direction. The FBLP is also popularly referred to as the ricochet or pinball panic, or sometimes simply as going bananas. Once an FBLP is underway, there is no stopping it. It gains momentum at every stride, and the participant gets so caught up in it they forget the reason for holding it in the first place. They'll panic right out of the woods, onto a road, down the road, through a town, and back into the woods, all the time picking up momentum. One time when we were kids, my friend Rich and I panicked right through a logging crew, and the loggers dropped what they were doing and ran along with us, under the impression we were being pursued by something. When they found out all we were doing was panicking, they fell back, cursing, and returned to their work. This tendency of panic to feed upon itself gives it an ever-increasing momentum. Instead of the FBLP, I recommend the stationary or modified panic. It offers the same therapeutic effect and subsides after a few minutes with none of the adverse side effects. The modified panic expends energy by bouncing up and down, stomping, yelling, and generally having a fit all in one place. It's no less undignified, but it concludes leaving the user no worse off than he was before. He's still just as lost, but now he's not just as lost and with 2 broken legs. Once that you have established the fact that you are indeed lost and have performed the perfunctory panic, you may get started on the business of survival. So panicking and getting lost is just part of this kind of chase, but as we come into this story and this time period, it's also, I always like to remember something I picked up from Stephen Ambrose, that when you think about the opening and the closing of the West, it all happened within the span of one long lifetime. Lewis and Clark's voyage of discovery happened from 1804 to 1806, and in 1869, only, 63 years later, the spike was driven at Promontory Point in Utah, completing the Transcontinental Railroad. By that time, the Native American situation was on its way to closure. The buffalo were defeated. The Pony Express had come and gone. The greatest era of the cowboy was over. But the southern forest had not yet been seriously exploited, partially due to the fact that there was no flood control, there was no railroad, and these forests stood as they had stood in the 1600s and for time out of immemorial. So what this book gets to explore is an almost live touch of something that was prehistoric and is gone. So Teddy Roosevelt, who famously came to the Delta on a bear hunt, the teddy bear story comes from there, of course. He said of the trees of the Mississippi Delta are unsurpassed by any others in the eastern forest, and are rivaled on the continent only by the sequoias of the Sierras. So this is where McCafferty's historiography begins. And as a background interest to his everyday years, that McCafferty pulled these stories together through interlibrary loan, like I described, and in doing that, he encountered Emerson Huff, who I've introduced. And then they encounter, McCafferty discovers through Huff, this original Robert Bobo. And that's where the superhuman character comes to life, because Bobo had never sought out anything but bears. He certainly didn't seek fame. He was a specialist, and he was dedicated to what he did. He was a landowner in the Delta. He had cleared just enough land to grow enough crops to be able to afford to live well enough to hunt bears, and that's what he did. Early reports in the book talk about him having killed 300 bears in a year. That's remarkable, but not unusual. That may have been his highest figure, but they routinely killed bears left and right on these hunts, which were they were pursued with some tremendous vigor. His primary hunting ground was south of the Sunflower River, a completely untouched swath of ground, 40 miles wide by 75 miles long. They didn't have a house on it, didn't have a garden patch on it, didn't have anything that showed the mark of man on it. No roads, certainly. So this is where we get into the woods with Mr. Bobo. So any kind of pursuit like this is a team effort with hunter and dogs, and it's from the dog's perspective that I most truly enjoyed this. I grew up rabbit hunting. We would follow beagles. We would wade through some pretty thick briars, some canes sometimes. There were no bears, of course, but the symbiotic nature, the teamwork between the people and the dogs was just as significant there as it would have been for Bobo in the bear woods. So, as I said, it was rough on the bears. I mean, rough on the dogs. Rough on the bears, too. But from the hunter's perspective, it was rough on the dogs. But you think about this, you think of why were we doing it, or why was he doing it? It wasn't for sport. They certainly used the meat, but it wasn't out of any kind of life or death necessity. It was the pursuit of an instinct, honestly, on the part of the hunter, on the part of the horses, and certainly on the part of the dogs. It's what they live to do, dog and man. And from that perspective, it's easy to respect it, or easier to respect it. So here's Huff comes to the Delta, and Bobo shows him around his place, and then this happens. After giving Huff a tour of his plantation, Bobo went into his house and came out holding a hunting horn, which was a cow's horn hollowed out and wrapped in rawhide for strength, and it was like a bugle. There's no reed in it, but there was a way to blow it to make it sound the hunting horn. "I'll show you a few dogs," Bobo said, in what was the first of numerous understatements Huff would hear during the course of his Delta sojourn. The planter loosed a blast from his horn, and I like this because it sounds like something from the Old Testament, at which there came a great confusion of tongues. And the bear pack came running in from every direction, and from every hole and recess within sound of the horn. Hounds appeared from under the house, and out of the house, and behind the house, wrote an amazed Huff. The barns and outbuildings likewise poured forth canines, and the yard filled with a howling, jumping, baying lot of dogs, more than Huff had ever seen in one pack before. "This is only a few of them," Bobo said to Huff. They later learned that the pack, which was spread into different groups at different places, generally numbered 60 to 80 dogs. And as with any dog pack like that, what are these dogs? What breed are these dogs? There was no purebred anything there. What he's brought together is a combination of instincts. He liked to have some foxhound as part of what he was doing to be discerning. He needed some beagle to be able to pick up all sorts of trails. He needed some bulldog for the fight, some terrier, and so for the tenacity. And this would be basically bred and mixed in, and then the whole batch of dogs goes hunting, and the smarter ones live longer. That's really no way to. There's no other way to say it. It's the dogs were there for a good time, but not for a long time. And that's not to be crass or cruel. It's just how it was. And you could see, you could look at that and say, well, that's unnecessary. But you look at the hunter, and he's living the same way the dogs are. I mean, there's other than actually closing on the bear with his own teeth, there's not anything the dogs are enduring that the hunter is not. Because you picture where you're going to come up with a bear is in these canebreaks. So the bear feed into open woods, but they hide and live in these cane, and the cane could run on for miles in every direction. So when they eventually bring the bear to bay, so they jump a bear, the bear takes off, the dogs take off after the bear, the hunters take off after the dogs, and everybody's running through the woods in a mass confusion of ruckus. So it's just like a big rabbit hunt, the tasks include figuring out if it's really a bear. If it is, you try to get all your dogs on the bear. Then you need to keep the pursuit hot, and you need to cut off the pursuit somewhere. So the different members on horseback are riding up and down through the woods trying to make this happen, smashing through cane, damaging themselves. Then if it's a smaller one, it'll go up a tree. If it's not, it'll just stop and turn around and fight. And at that point, with the bear mostly cornered, the hunters race to get there before something bad happens or something worse happens, and dispatch the bear at very close range. It's a long shot, might be 20 yards. So, and the instances of misfortune from the bear being visited on the hunters is not uncommon. It's one of those things, it's sort of like getting injured in the rodeo. It's not if you'll get hurt, it's when. So every one of these hunters was just a model of toughness if they continued at it for any length. So the dogs themselves were really good at what they did. But here's a little description of life in camp when it was time to feed the dogs. There being no Purina dog chow in the canebreaks in those days, hunting dogs were generally fed a homemade concoction called dog bread, the recipe for which varied from hunter to hunter. Typically, the base was cornbread with meat broth, which included bear, of course, meat scraps or other additives. The hired hands were unaccustomed to feeding 53 hungry dogs at one time, and the dog bread cooking was running way behind the hounds' appetites. Consequently, as the food was dished out, the pack's pecking order decided who ate first. The bear dogs, being by nature and nurture a pugnacious lot, did not always agree as to what the pecking order was, and it was generally determined on an ad hoc basis. As a result, there were groups of dogs fighting for a propitious place in the chow line all over the camp. The scrapping hounds, Huff wrote, would fight anywhere they happened to be, by the fire, under the horses, or between someone's legs. The hunters, whenever possible, broke up the fights, but the dogs generally feared nothing. So that's what you're dealing with there. So it was a tremendously rough way of life, but again, it was a chase of an instinct, and it's an interesting book. I think McCafferty's done a really good job of it. If any of this has tweaked your interest, I hope you'll give it a read. I certainly appreciate y'all having me come visit with you. Are there any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Have you ever hunted bear?
I have not. I have not. Bear hunts of the sort they describe here, where you're actually jumping and chasing bear, they take place, they still do that some in West Virginia, and I know it goes on some in Ohio and Kentucky to some extent, but that's all a per invitation thing, and I've not had an invitation. Yes, sir.
I don't know if this is true, but I've been told that way back in those times, most of the bears were not killed with gunshots, but with knives. Is some truth to that?
Significant truth to that. McCafferty does his best to parse through those stories. all of the hunters in that time carried what they called a cane knife of some description, and all these, it's sort of like Bowie knives. There's no two that are exactly alike. They're all homemade one way or another, but what it amounted to was it's almost like more of a Roman short sword than a pocket knife, because they would literally cut through cane machete style with this knife, but then also have it, if they had to close with a bear with it. Generally, they would shoot the bear with a rifle or a handgun. That would be plan A. But depending on how things shook out, plan B needed to be close at hand. So McCafferty found some hunters that professed to hunt and intend to kill the bear with nothing but a knife. But mostly, they didn't intend to do it that way, but they were willing and able to, and if they bear hunted over any length of time, they eventually did. Yes, ma'am.
I was born and raised in Sunflower County.
Yes, ma'am.
I never saw a deer. My whole anything. My daddy was a big well hunter. And every once in a while he'd come home and he'd say, I jumped a deer today. But now bear, when I got married, I worked on the river, a place called Dalton Pineland.
Yes, ma'am.
And out in the pastures, the cows would run these baby bears up trees, and they would stay out there for days until somebody would go out there and make the cows, because cows wouldn't move. They just keep them up the tree. They would go out there and run the cows away, and then the bear would come down. But you see bear on the river, all the time.
There's some argument that there should be a subspecies of black bear called the Louisiana black bear, and I think there's actually one identified as such, and the bears that occur in Louisiana and Arkansas and Mississippi are of that subspecies. Generally, as the description goes, they're heavier and hardier for their environment, so they tend to run to 300 and 400 and 500 pounds, and even larger on instance, but an adult bear is 300 pounds generally, and a little up. When I read this, I tried to figure out, is there any patch of old-growth forest, just a patch, left anywhere in the Delta that you could go see? And I confess I didn't just expend every possible set of, ma'am? Right. So there's a patch or two, but generally there's not. But it's worth a look for sure. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Bear population now in Mississippi, is there an estimate?
There are certainly estimates. I would be remiss in trying to quote that. It's not a huntable population. They're very rigidly protected. Yes, ma'am.
I told you, my neighbors thought he found bear scat. Do you think that is possible? My neighborhood, Lee County.
Ms. Gratz says her neighbor found bear sign in a neighborhood here in Tupelo. That's entirely possible. The black bears are sighted not routinely, but they're sighted occasionally in northeast Mississippi. There was one that was eating somebody's dog food regularly in Booneville a couple years ago. There are black bears certainly in the Delta, and the way a black bear family unit works is the unit that exists, the mother of the bears, once the cubs reach a certain age, she runs them plumb off. And I don't mean just to the other side of the creek either. They are sent away. So they're not migrating exactly, but they're not exactly not, if that makes sense. So black bears passing back and forth, and there's a tremendous supply of them in the Smokies. So I'd say if it looked like bear sign, it probably was. Almost certainly it was.
We have cameras out in the woods and stuff, and you can see when bear, when they come up to your feeders, your deer feeders and stuff, and they eat away, and, bobcats, and all kinds of stuff.
They'll eat whatever they decide to eat. They're as a critter goes, they're very much like a 400-pound raccoon.
Yeah.
That's exactly, they can climb into anything, tear into anything. I've not hunted bears. I've been around bears on a number of occasions. One of the guys we turkey hunt with in the deep South Florida, south of Okeechobee, it's in the landform that forms the Everglades, but it's not Everglades National Park. It's just the same sort of swamps. Bears eat his cameras. So And he loses cameras to bears regularly for game trail cameras. So he puts up, the swamp is very thick, to get some idea where the turkeys are. You put up game cameras that take pictures of what walks by, just like you would with whitetail. The bears walk by and eat the cameras. So they get crunched up. Yes, ma'am.
Are they on the other side of the levee, bear population?
There's no huntable population of black bears in the deep south that I'm aware of, but there are certainly instances of black bears throughout Louisiana and Arkansas and Mississippi. Yes, ma'am. Anything else? Yes, sir.
The stories in the book correlate pretty well with Faulkner's story about the land and the hunt.
Very much, and he mentions Faulkner in here, but they do. One follows the other pretty well. Mr. Huff would have certainly been a contemporary of Faulkner. I don't know that they ever shared notes or anything, but there's some neat stories for sure. Yes, sir.
Did you say that you weren't able to find any old growth forests just to see what it was like?
There's some in Belzoni, but as far as huge swaths go, there's none. But it's just a sample left.
There's a black bear right now, right out of Isola, before you get into Inverness.
Mm-hmm. I
have family that lives there.
The State Department of MDWFP has a pretty good bear program. I don't know what adjective I was looking for. A very well-run and vigorous bear program. So if you go online to mdwfp.com, Mississippi Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and just click around till you find bear program. They track bears, they do surveys on bears, and at certain times of year they'll put live cameras in a bear den, and you can watch baby bears scurry around in the dark as they're wont to do. So it's pretty interesting for sure. Thank y'all so much.